Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation, an agency of the federal government established by Congress to improve teaching about the United States Constitution.
But once they realize that Washington isn't going to be president forever, then the elbows start flying. And then the partisan press emerges. And for the first time, there becomes this real shift, a very consequential shift in attitudes. During the period leading up to the writing of the Constitution, in fact, during the period leading up to the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence, there was this belief that political parties were a bane on the existence of any political system. And when Americans talked about parties, they talked about these bad groupings in Britain that had been influential in the bad legislation Parliament had passed that had caused the rift between the colonies and the mother country. And they created, that is, with the Declaration of Independence, Americans created this republic, okay? And they believed that a republic would not be, should not be, must not be infiltrated by a partisan spirit. Because partisanship, as they understood it, was the willingness, the desire, the insistence on putting the interests of party ahead of the interests of country. And almost to a person, they believed that a republic to survive required civic virtue, the willingness to put the interests of the whole in front of the interests of individuals. And so to admit that parties might emerge in America would be to acknowledge, boy, we were really wrong. And furthermore, we wrote this Constitution on fundamentally false assumptions. Because the Constitution specifies checks and balances. But the groups being checked and balanced are the different branches of government. So, okay, the legislature is going to put a check on the executive and vice versa. The judiciary will put a check on the others. There is always a recourse if the executive vetoes statute. You can override a veto. If the judiciary says something, we can always revise the Constitution. But nobody thought about, well, what happens if these extra constitutional institutions arise, these parties? Who is going to check them? And do people, so when the Constitution was being written, it was assumed that members of Congress would be jealous of the prerogatives of Congress and even the two houses themselves. So senators, they would make sure that the executive didn't run away with the government. But nobody, at the Constitutional Convention, there's essentially no talk of political parties except to say, we don't want those to be here, and we're going to do our best to make sure they don't arise.
Well, there's not a word in the Constitution as ratified about political parties. You mentioned the partisan press that so bedeviled Washington, especially in his second term, with the aid under the table, by the way, of Thomas Jefferson. So could you talk with us a little bit then about the creation of the first truly national political party by Jefferson with the help of Madison?
The term that was often used before party became accepted was faction. And here I should sort of distinguish. Everybody understood that when a bill in Congress comes up for a vote, there will be a divide, those for and those against. So there's this binary separation. And in elections, you choose this candidate or that candidate. You might have multiple candidates, but there is in the nature of majoritarian politics a yes or no. So my side, your side. The pros, the antis. But it was assumed by the writers of the Constitution, under this notion of civic virtue, that okay, we will have these views, we will separate, and that's the term they often use in Parliament, so they'll separate to vote, one side or the other. But but they won't be permanent, and they will shift. So on financial issues, for example, maybe I will agree with you, but on issues of foreign policy, I will agree with somebody else. And this is where the lack of experience of these people in Republican politics, because of course there was no Republican politics in America before the Declaration of Independence, but they didn't recognize the degree to which individuals would engage in what later would be called log rolling. You know, I'll vote for your bill if you vote for my bill. And so they didn't wind up voting on every issue simply on the merits of the issue. It had to do as well with, okay, I need your vote for this issue, so I'll give you my vote for that issue. And so these factions emerged. So from sort of nothing to factions, but factions still were considered to be sort of fairly temporary. They would represent similar interests. So the manufacturers in America, or the merchants in America, or New England tobacco growers, or whatever it might be. And it was understood that they might have similar interests. But to go beyond that, to mobilize those interests, to institutionalize those interests, that was something else. And it emerged during the 1790s on the part of both the groups that come to be called the Federalists and the Republicans, although they often don't call themselves that, and they don't always call the other ones that. And my history students are always bedeviled by the fact that the first Republican Party, the Jefferson Republican Party, always seems to get labeled in textbooks as the Democratic-Republican Party. But they never called themselves that. I mean, this is to distinguish for the students from the Lincoln Republican Party. That's really, but anyway. So they don't know what to call each other. They don't call each other parties, but they operate like parties. They have people who work essentially for the party, and it emerges first in terms of newspapers. Newspapers that take a particular side on all of these issues, that are basically underwritten by individuals who are grouping together. Now, sometimes in their capacity as office holders. So when Jefferson was Secretary of State, he could hire people who would work sort of part-time as translators who do this, that, and then on the side, they would have their newspaper. Oh, and also because if you hold a government office, then you can throw the government business to your favorite newspaper because the government posts notices and all this other stuff. So then you get this group of people. It emerges first in terms of the press. And the press, as of the 1790s, interestingly, looks a lot like the news media today, where if you have a particular point of view, if you're conservative, you will like Fox News. If you're a liberal progressive, you like MSNBC. Well, the same was true back then. For those of us, I was born in the 1950s. We grew up in an age when there were only a few television stations, and they were required to be balanced. There was something called the Fairness Doctrine. So we grew up with the idea that the media would sort of play it down the middle. And there were certain newspapers that liked to imagine that they did the same thing. And so the New York Times liked to think, and what used to be called or maybe still is called the mainstream media, but now in a pejorative sense, they sort of played it down the middle. But in the early days, they didn't play down the middle at all. If you liked the policies of Jefferson and Madison, then you would read their papers. And if you liked the policies of the Federalists, you'd read their papers. So we often think of people living in their political silos, in their political cocoons today. This goes way back. It's people like having their intelligence flattered by reading newspapers with editorial positions that agree with them and tell them how smart they are. So this has very deep roots in American history.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.